Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great. And yourself?
Pretty good. A little rushed these days. Otherwise,
Uh,
okay. Where are you coming from?
I'm in Toronto. Yourself? Toronto, Canada.
Great. Um, Love Toronto. Did some lectures on Masters of the Air up there at the university.
Which university?
University of Toronto,
Oh, Toronto. Okay. Okay. Cool.
downtown.
Awesome. Was wonderful. Was that recently or?
No, that was when the book came out. A guy named Keith Lowe had done a book on Hamburg, and we
Mm,
kind of did a dog and pony show and at the university. Had a big
wonder.
crowd and pretty raucous. They were arguing with one another about, you know, whether there was overbombing. And of course, Dresden came up. And it was a pretty, Toronto, is, as you know, a very international city. And so you get a lot of interesting points of view and people who've actually are still around that lived through these events. And they bring a lot of ardor to the enterprise. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
It
no,
was it
absolutely.
was it was Valentine's Day, but there was no love in the air.
It was all discussions and debates. Wonderful. Donald, if you don't mind me asking you if it's possible, if not, that's okay. Your iPad is positioned vertically. Are you able to rotate it
Oh yeah.
horizontally? Like that'd be great. Perfect. That's awesome. Yeah, so thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it. Looking forward to Masters of the Air series for a long time now. Obviously, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about
You can
the
talk
book.
about it. That's fine.
Okay, so I'll let you figure out whatever you want to talk about. I don't want to,
Yeah.
put you in any kind of
We,
position because I,
we just can't talk about individual scenes so we don't give anything away. And but
yeah.
otherwise we're
So,
okay.
so if I ask something, just tell me right off the bat that I can't, because I don't know what limitations you may
I
have
don't
in
either. They didn't. Apple didn't lay down a. They just said be cautious.
careful.
And
Yeah, got it.
exactly. No
So,
surprises. They want all the surprises.
absolutely. And I don't want any spoilers either, and I'm sure people don't either. So,
Yeah,
you know, uh,
exactly.
uh, w- Donna, what I love to do all the time when I talk to people is that I always try to understand their journey and where they've been and where they're coming from. So, your journey as an author, when did it start and your connection with what you write? Just learning more about you, who you are, and
Yeah.
where have you been?
Well, I went to graduate school at the University of Maryland, and I finished most of my work at Yale. Was living in Washington and worked for a time, short time, at the Washington Post. And I was doing a dissertation at the time on the 1930s, and that got the writing bug going. And writing pieces for the Outlook section, longer pieces. I didn't have to do. I started out on the city desk and went over to the Outlook section, and we did features that appeared every 2 weeks, so we had time to do them. And I kind of decided that I was more of a long distance runner than a sprinter, and maybe didn't want to do newspaper work on a regular basis. So books were the thing, but breaking through was a big deal. Of course, I got my dissertation published. I think 8 people read it. Um, you know, not even all my family, but uh, I had had a book party, and I thought, oh, this is a great way to sell the first book. So I bought a couple of boxes. My friends took all the books home and didn't pay for them. And so that was my launch into big time writing. But we had some books after that. And most of my early books were not on military history. I had never taken a military history course as an undergraduate or a graduate student. I was mildly interested in it, a lot interested in it when I was a kid. My dad was in the Air Force in World War II. I had an uncle that flew against Japan in those big fire raids, another uncle that served with the First Division, the big red one. He was landed in the first 10 minutes at D-Day. So I grew up in a military family in an ethnic neighborhood in a little town called Reading, Pennsylvania, railroad town. It's on the Monopoly board, okay? And one of the four railroads. And so that was there, and our attic was always filled with memorabilia that my uncles had brought home from the war. They all lived with my grandparents, housing shortage after the war. So us kids went in there and grabbed gas masks and Lugers and bomber jackets and everything else. But then my interest fluctuated to what's called history of ideas, intellectual history, it's pretentiously called. And I started doing books actually on cities. I did a major biography of a very important urban critic and architectural critic named Louis Mumford. Big in Canada, actually. I did a big series in Canadian broadcasting and internationally known. And that was my first shot at biography. And I didn't do an official biography. I did not want to do that, but I did have exclusive access to his papers. And then I did books on Chicago. I never lived in Chicago, but I was transfixed by the city, by its dramatic, electric growth in the 19th century. And saw it as the epitomization of America in all its splendor and squalor, and crazy place, capital of capitalism, capital of socialism, you name it. And then did another large book, can't stay away from that, writing books, on Manhattan in the 1920s. Wanted to catch the zeitgeist of the 20th century. Tall buildings, jazz music, you name it, big transportation breakthroughs, the renovation of Grand Central Station, and the building of modern Manhattan, basically central Manhattan, from the Empire State Building to Central Park. There were about 2 skyscrapers below 42nd Street at the time, between 42nd and Park, and there are over 300 9 years later. So biggest building boom in the history of cities. And then my dad passed away, and I kind of felt really like, well, don't use the word kind of. I felt pretty guilty that I hadn't addressed his war in any way in any of my work, and so I started a book, not knowing a lot about World War II except what I saw on Victory at Sea and things like that. I wrote a book called The Story of World War II. Henry Steele Commander's name, for some reason, appears on that book. I guess we got the rights from him, but I never met him, and he didn't collaborate on the book. It was my book. I was awfully mad at the lawyers at Simon & Schuster for putting his name on the book. But anyway, I did that and followed it up with a book on the Pacific, about the amphibious landings by the Army and the Marines in the Pacific, D-Days in the Pacific. And then I did a switch to the Civil War, and did a book on Ulysses Grant and his campaign to capture Vicksburg. I loved writing that book. And the book I'm writing now is a continuation of that. I take Lincoln and Grant, they first meet right after Vicksburg, face to face, and they'd hardly even corresponded. And they form literally a partnership that brings down Dixie, brings down the Old South, including slavery. So I'm about halfway through that book right now, and enjoying it a lot. And splitting my time, I do some film, and I work with Tom Hanks on a number of projects, and PBS, American Experience, did a thing on Ulysses Grant, and they also filmed did a weekly series on my Chicago book called City of the Century. It's the title of the book, City of the Century. It was about 19th century Chicago. From the time it was a mud flat, with 16 people, to the end of the century, when it was the 3rd largest city in the world. And there was a guy there. I found his diary in the Chicago library. And he lived in old Chicago in the 1820s. And he died when Chicago was a skyscraper city, and he never moved. So that's how fast that transformation was. And I love writing that book because I really took to Chicago and got a lot of help from the mayor and city council about helicopters. And police boats, places to go, and films, certain spots, and access to certain libraries that weren't open to the public. It was a real welcoming experience. Got to know and become friends with Studs Terkel, and it was a great run in Chicago.
Mm,
As a writing experience, yeah.
sure. That's wonderful. One of the things that you talked about kind of resonated with me personally too, because I come from a military family as well. My dad, he served in the army of Pakistan, and for 30 years, and he fought two wars. And I have been so connected, and I spent 13 years of my life back home, in that environment
Yeah.
of the military life. And I've always been connected to war movies, like like from Bridge on River Kwai to Longest
Yeah.
Stay to Saving Private Ryan, and Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and it's just it's crazy that I always wonder, aside from that factor of coming from a military family, what attracts me to it, and it hit me about a couple of months ago. It's just the idea of, which is very obvious, right? But for me, it was a revelation about a couple of months ago because I thought about it, is that this idea of these so-called, our image of soldiers are like powerful men with guns, fighting wars. But at the end of the day, you watch a film like Saving Private Ryan or, Platoon, like they're just average human beings, and that resonates with all of us, and that's what works. I mean, it's a very obvious thing, but I had to think about it to figure out what could possibly be the other reason for me to be attracted to that, and that's why I'm so so looking forward to Masters of the Air, because of that element. And obviously watching the teaser trailer, it literally starts off with that human condition, how they're just looking at this imagery of bombs falling, and it's like some sort of art in one way or another, not for the people who are, suffering from it. So I really appreciate you, doing all these things. And something that I'm a filmmaker myself. I make documentaries and films about social and political and
Yeah, I've read your
human
biography. Yeah.
okay, human rights stuff. And I would love to do something similar, kind of like what you talked about, like how you never did anything military based, because of your father after he passed away. And now that you mention it, I mean, my father is alive and well, thank God. And I've never done anything like that too. So it's sort of something that when you said that, it kind of hit me like maybe I need to do something similar of some sort, one way or another. Uh, but I appreciate you sharing all that. So I just want to share my point of view, to your connection, to the military and the life that I have come from. Moving on to
But
Masters of Air.
that's so important because you'll be bringing what I hoped I brought to your work, your humanistic background and your interest
Mm,
in individual human beings. And I know when I first started writing about World War II, I was most interested in what I was interested in as a kid, the combat experience. We'd play army, and pretend you're
yeah.
dead and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I often wondered, I remember reading in high school, The Red Badge of Courage, what would I do under that kind of stress? Would I fake it? Would I fight? Um, and it, as Eric Severide, the reporter, pointed out, it is a willed condition, courage, and you can lose it. And so I was really interested when I started Masters with what you're talking about. Um,
Mm,
the story of World War II, you couldn't get into that book. The door that allowed you into my book was you had to be at the tip of the spear. You had to have been in combat, and that includes civilians under the bombs, and in wrecked villages and things like that. You had to have really viscerally experienced the war, and I was interested in the reaction. How demoralized were the British after the bombing of Coventry? How did
mm,
the Germans hold up after Dresden? How did the guys in the cockpits hold up and in the fuselages? And so when Hanks approached me about doing this film based on the book, I think he and Spielberg told me that they were most interested in that part of the story. And could we really bring that forward? Take you inside the plane rather than having a George Lucas kind of
Hmm.
dogfight. And
Right.
so and we even specially designed this isn't a secret, but Spielberg built three B-17s for the show. They don't fly, but we simulate that. And they're every screw, every dial, every bulb, it's exactly to
Oh,
specification
wow.
B-17. That's the thing about this film. It has complete fidelity. Every bottle of liquor in the Officers Club is exactly the liquor that was drank. It was being drunk in 1944. The cigarettes, the toothbrushes, everything, the socks, even down to our costume designer going crazy when she found out we were using the wrong shoelaces. So we were really shooting for, as I'll give you an instance. I was watching the filming of the episode where the flyers are called into the briefing room and told they're going to bomb Normandy. And they're hurraying and standing and this and that. And I just happened to move some papers on the desk. I was sitting in an off-screen office that was an officer's bailiwick. And I went to the bottom of the pile of papers, and they were really Air Force papers. He could have put anything in there. He could have put, advertisements about yogurt, but they
Yeah.
were there. And
Wow.
that's what we really tried to stress, taking you inside to such an extent that after we built the second B-17, the cameramen were having trouble moving around in the very tight fuselage, much more constricted than a submarine. And it was difficult. So Spielberg built a larger one. You couldn't film from the outside. So it had more breadth, and our cameramen could move around there really well. So I think almost all the combat action scenes, and it's not a film dominated by them, but all the combat action scenes take place with live actors inside the plane. And we watch their reaction. And as Tom said to us when we first started, how did they get in the planes the next day after experiencing a, a traumatic, raid where comrades were killed, lots of planes were lost, and they went back to barracks where the beds had been stripped and the belongings of the downed airmen had disappeared. And it was really, and you went out in the morning and you're for a softball game and your right fielder, second baseman, and pitcher aren't there. Well, how do you? And then there's a mission that night. Um, Joe Heller, who was a good friend of mine, we taught together at City University. I, I think Joe was after that and caught that in Catch 22, that all you had to do was say no, and you didn't fly, and you lived.
Mm.
Now you got a reduction in rank, mm-hmm. But there was no corporal punishment or jailing, and the British really stigmatized you. They called it lack of moral fiber. Whoa. And they blamed it on their psychiatric staffs who had somehow let this guy through and didn't pick up his absence of moral fiber. The Americans were much more understanding about it, and mostly because of crew pressure. Guys understood that it can happen to anybody, and did happen to just about any type of person, the bravest of the brave.
Right.
It happens to Gregory Peck, in the best movie ever made on the 12 o'clock eye. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that what you just said kind of reminds me of the scene from Saving Private Ryan where they're having this argument whether they should kill the German soldier or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And then Tom Hanks' character, it goes in the corner and just starts he breaks down. Now, obviously, he couldn't do it in front of his juniors because the leadership, and you don't want to lower the morale and everything. But yeah, it's just the human condition, and like I said, I mean, from what I've seen with the teaser, just right off the bat, like instead of showing like a battle sequence to get people's attention, which are not normally a lot of trailers would, like just to hook people, it just captured, at least for me and a lot of people, you know, just that human condition. And that's the reason Band of Brothers was so successful. That's the reason The Pacific was so successful. That's the reason Saving Private was so successful. Platoon, Captain. I've spoken to Captain Dale, who's the consultant in terms of
They'll
training.
die. Yeah,
Yeah, Dale die on Platoon, Private Ryan, Band
yeah,
Brothers,
we've
Pacific,
used
and this
them.
series.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we used it for Ryan.
and it's just it just kind of the amount of work that goes into this. Now with Saving Private Ryan, I know, and with the other two series, there was a lot of boot camp that was done. Was it similar to your knowledge with this series as well?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I used a guy from M16, and a guy who currently works as a consultant for NATO. He's a commando, lots
Mm.
of combat experience, and a ranger as well. And I've toured with him um, and talked with him a lot about you know escape and invasion and things like that. What kind of tools inside your body could you call on? What kind of psychological defenses did you have to prevent you from disclosing secrets, saying something out of untoward that will reveal the position of your men, et cetera, et cetera. So then we got the actors and we put um, Bob Shaw is his name, and Bob put them through a Dale Dye type of experience. In Saving Private Ryan, when it was filmed in Ireland, and they put him out
Yeah.
in the woods, and it was raining, and it was really a typical Irish day. I remember when I lived in England, I was teaching at Oxford, and when the weather would come on, it always you didn't have to describe the weather in Ireland. There was a big black cloud on the map, over Ireland. So anyway, they're out there and feeling like drowned rats, and they decided to quit. The actors, they had
Yeah.
enough. They couldn't take it, and everybody voted that way except Hanks. He voted last, and then they changed their mind.
Yeah.
And what Spielberg was after is they were going to meet Matt Damon later, and Matt didn't go through this. And he showed up the first day with a $6,000 outfit on and coiffed hair and everything, and they hated him immediately, which is what the
The
idea of the
story
film is.
was,
You
yeah,
don't want to
yeah,
land there and go look for some guy. You want to kill Germans and save yourself and go home
yeah.
to your family. But yeah, we did do that. We taught them, the actors, to be soldiers. Um, there was nothing like what happened with Steve Spielberg when a guy came up to him, for example, and said he thought that the helmet might mess his hair up. He didn't last but an hour. We had nothing like that. And everybody kind of was, it was an amazing, we had a lot of actors, and almost all of them are young.
Right.
And they're all going to, many of them are going to be very famous. And some of them already are. And yeah, they saw the opportunities, but they also bought in when they learned a little bit about the experience. When we mentioned to them that the 8th Air Force lost 26,000 killed, and then compared that to 18,500 killed Marines killed in the whole Pacific War from from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, just that one small outfit, that 77% of the guys who flew were casualties. That
Mm.
when the Air Force is often denigrated for not accurately bombing on D-Day, for missing the German guns on the cliffs. Well, they did it to save lives. The troops were so packed together, and
Yeah.
they all knew that pinpoint bombing was an oxymoron, that it was not accurate, and
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of spillage and things. But you don't have an invasion, and I think we make this clear without doing it didactically in the film. And that's one of the things. We're not going to point fingers and um, make moral judgments. The men will make their own moral judgments, and they are myriad. But we do point out that they lost over 18,000 pilots and crews in the run up to D-Day. 8,000 more men killed to prepare the beach than, the 4,000 or 5,000 that were killed on the beach. So,
Right.
yeah, and appropriately, the 100th Bomb Group and a bunch of us are putting together a monument to the 8th, like the monument that the 100th has on the beach, an obelisk they have. We're going to actually have something like I don't know if you've seen it, but with their own money, not with RAF money or government money, the bomber crews of the Royal Air Force put up a monument in Hyde Park. And it's spectacular. It's spectacular. And lit up at night, and with statues of crewmen in combat outfits. And we're going to do one of those at a place called La Fière, which is where the 82nd Airborne fought a horrible battle to keep the German tanks off the beaches when the Higgins boats were coming in. And we'll have a tableau with 4 airmen, a Medal of Honor winner who was a private, Rosie Rosenthal, who's kind of the star of our show and certainly the star of my book, and one of the major fighter commanders, haven't quite decided, and Jimmy Doolittle, who was the commander of the 8th from January of 44 on to the end of the war. So we have a sculptor. We actually have the money. It's happening now, and
Good.
We should be finished next year. Yeah.
That's great. Going back to your book, how long it took you to write the book, and what was the biggest hurdle, if you can remember, in writing the book, whether it was research or access or whatever?
Compression is the biggest hurdle. There were a lot of books on the 8th. Of course, you Google this stuff when you start. You don't want to write something that's been done and done and
before.
done.
Yeah.
And when I read a lot of the books, I try to write the kind, and that's perhaps explains why I'm a kind of a professor of things in general, why I roam into other people's fields and things like this. I'm a trespasser and not a specialist. And I'm interested in writing what I'm interested in reading. And that's the kind of book. I wanted to read a book about the 8th, as I read a number of books on the 8th. It kind of did the whole shebang, did the flying and the fighting, but also did the on-base experience, the medical experiments they did with the men. And they were experiments because the whole war was an experiment. No one had ever flown this high. No one had ever bombed from this fight. No one had ever fought this high. Everything was new, and they were the guinea pigs. So they invented air warfare, and as they went along. And I thought that was really interesting. And I'd never seen a book done like that, nor did I see a book done that dealt with not just casualties, but the actual people who experience death and dismemberment and things like that. I wanted real life characters, and I wanted to write it like a novel. I wanted it to have all the components of a novel, momentum. I wanted to have the best way to describe it would be my off-mentioned thing to people. I talk about the fallacy of hindsight. How if you know what's going to, what it is, you know what's going to happen, you're going to write a pretty bad book because everything is organized, and the British are not going to win the Revolutionary War. Now, if you did the Revolutionary War without knowing that, it would be very suspenseful because the British should have kicked the hell out of it. Okay. And we talk about an underdog battle, or Vietnam versus the US. So you have to take the reader behind the eyes of the people that you're writing about at the point they make these decisions without knowing the future. None of us knows the future. You or I do not know what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes. And so it is with every historical character. So you try to do that. And that was the hardest challenge, trying to do that. And another hard challenge was integrating interpretive material into storytelling. And here my guide was Barbara Tuchman. And she once pointed out, if you tell the story in all its particulars, and it's actually happened, and you tell it kind of like the way it happens, because you'll never get it exactly, the interpretation will kind of sneak up to you and tap you on the shoulder. It's there. It's there. And I do find that happening when I do battle scenes now. I'm writing about Ulysses Grant against Robert E. Lee in a place called The Wilderness. And nobody won that battle. But it swayed back and forth until the last half hour. No one had the advantage. And it's interesting to look at it, from that perspective. As I once asked one of my stupidest questions to a B-17 crewman, I said to him, and this is like a quote, I said, "Hey, how come you guys bombed Dresden so close to the end of the war?" He said, "How in the hell did we know it was the end of the war? We had just buried the dead from the Battle of the Bulge. We didn't have enough powder in our arsenal to mount another offensive for another 5 or 6 weeks. The Russians had to do it. And when they began their January offensive." But that's a good point. That's a good point. So they were, and there's always research challenges, And then you have to be very careful with, as you know, you do a lot of interviewing. And interviews are great. But if you get somebody talking about something that happened 40 years ago, maybe even 60 years ago, it's not going to be exactly right. It just can't be. So, but you want to capture, and people just say, well, then don't do those. Yeah, you got to do the interviews. Yeah. He takes you to the spot. He doesn't forget what the trees were like in the Hürtgen forest when the Germans hit the tops of the trees and try to create tree bursts and things like that. You'll never forget that and what that was like, or the death of a comrade or thing. But he might forget that it was the 82nd rather than the 94th that was in the next foxhole. So you check that stuff, which isn't too hard to check. And you don't use that part of the interview.
Of course.
But not to use it is pretentious, I think. If people get real sniffy, they'll look at the book and they'll say, somebody's book, and they'll say, "Oh, wow, look at all those interviews in there. That can't be any good." Well, I don't know.
No, I agree with you, because it is the interviews give you, like, even if you're interviewing, like when I interview people for my documentary, and even if it's like an incident that's 5 years ago or 2 years ago or 20 years ago, they may even have their own biases, right? Like we all have our own biases. But yeah, at least it gives you that human eye to kind of go into that event and try to understand it a little bit, and then you verify all the stuff, by interviewing an expert or another expert, and then you kind of go back and forth and counter that and try to present different point of views. That's 100% true. And you wrote the book, Donald, in 2007. Run by me, when did it come under the radar of Amblin and Playtone and HBO?
Well, yeah,
into the series.
Well, not right away. I had done, I did a film with Tom Hanks called, well, let me start at the beginning. I knew Hanks and Spielberg from my participation with the building of the World War II Museum in New Orleans. They were ahead of our initial push to raise money for the museum. They were there at the opening, et cetera. And I was a member of what's called the Presidential Counselors, which is the advisory board to the CEO. So I did get to know them and things like that. And I knew
Mm-hmm.
Ambrose very well because
Mm.
as an historian, and we had the same editor at Simon and Schuster's. So Steve and I were old buddies. And in fact, he gave me all of the interviews and diaries and things that he was going to use to write his magnum opus on the Pacific. And he said, all I ask you to do is call it D-Days in the Pacific, but you can use everything I have here. He told me that
Wow.
2 weeks. He told me that 2 weeks before he died. He called me down to New Orleans. He knew I was working on a biography of Ulysses Grant for the American Experience, WGBH in Boston. And I said, why Grant? He said, I'm dying, Don. Now, and Grant died of what I have, throat cancer. And I want to learn how to die with dignity. And then he took me over to his offices and showed me these files. He said, they're yours. And he had them all photocopied, shipped, paid the hotel bill for my wife and I without telling us. We checked out. We didn't know who paid. Of course, but he didn't say anything about it. But so I did know these guys. And back to the point, um, and then I did a film for the museum called Beyond All Boundaries. It's an introductory film to the museum, which had all the points we're trying to emphasize here, like contingency. Like I knew the film was at least semi-successful when I walked out and I heard a woman say to her husband, Frank, we could have lost that war. That's amazing. And that's what we were trying to convey in the film and in the museum. And then he asked me to, it was Dave McCullough who gave me a call. He was down at Plato, the offices of Hanks, Spielberg's at Amblin. And he was with a guy named Kurt Sadusky, who kind of runs the place. And I didn't know Kurt, but of course I knew David for a long time, again from Simon and Schuster. And I had his son as a student of mine at Lafayette College. And Dave said, I want you to meet Kurt here, and they need some help on the Pacific. And why don't you come out to LA and see if you can help? So I got pulled into that, and it was great. It was really a lot of fun working on that film, and on the website as well. And then we decided to do a film which hasn't been seen a lot because I don't know. I think HBO dropped the ball on it. It was going to be the third volume, Band of Brothers, and this was going to be the third volume in a sense, in that it took the veterans from the actual veterans we filmed from band and the actual veterans we filmed, Gene Sledge and whatnot, and take their stories from 45 down to the 60s and talk to their families, children, wives, etc., and do a film on that, on what combat does to human beings. And it's called He Has Seen War. And it's based on a documentary that the Army did. My son found it. He's a film archivist, moldering in the archives. And they never released it because they thought it was too tough. And the film says things like, this guy ain't the guy that went to war. Beware of him around the baby. He could be, the marriage could suffer. He could have spells. They explain that. And they take you into a mental hospital. And where airmen are treated for post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that. That film, the Houston film about that, Let There Be Light, that wasn't released either. So we thought we'd do a film on that. And I thought it was terrific. I think today it's a terrific film. And then time went on, and I got a phone call. I was taking my grandkids to the library, and they called me up, and from New Orleans, and no, it was from California, and Kurt Sadusky got on the phone and said, we're gonna do, we've been thinking about this a lot. We haven't told you, but we're gonna do Masters of the Air. And I said, oh boy. And I just come out of the library with the kids. And so I pulled the car over to the curb and to get my breath. And my littlest one said, well, what's going on? I said, well, you got to wait a minute before we get the ice cream because I'm talking to somebody important. And she said, well, I'm important too, Poppy. I said, okay, all right, I'll get off the phone soon. Call you when
She's
you know.
right.
And then and then that's when it began. And it was in the initial stages, it was a lonely enterprise because Tom did what I call his pep talk. He got us all together and said, this is the kind of thing I want to do. First of all, no cliches. Anybody here wants to do cliches? I don't want them on the film. I don't want the pilot getting shot, falling to the floor of the plane, having a last cigarette, tell Molly I said hello, kiss the baby for me. Okay, it might have happened, but it's been done.
So many times.
And we want fidelity, the thing we talked about at the beginning here.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to have composite characters. We don't have to have made up characters. Everything in the film has to have happened or it's not going to be in the film. And he said, that's going to be a challenge. And that's the way the film is. Everything. Now, everything, and this might be a spoiler, but the hell with it. Everything doesn't happen to exactly the same guy. Okay. Mm-hmm. And mostly it does. But sometimes it happens to a different guy. But the experience, the existential experience, like we do a scene on the bombing of a small German city, and the airmen are attacked and some are killed by German civilians and Luftwaffe police. So that's another thing he said, we want to do. And he said, and thirdly, I've seen a lot of World War II films. I want this to be the best one. And so we started talking like, is there a template? Is there an example? And he kept coming back to Das Boot. He thought Das Boot was supremely good. Mostly because, and you see this in his later films, especially on the convoys in the Atlantic, men doing their jobs. Everybody on the sub is just doing their job with no histrionics or anything like that, no Heil Hitlers. They're just doing their job. So with that, we started out, and HBO agreed to do it. The way it works is HBO gives them the money, since Plato doesn't have the money. Even Spielberg doesn't have the money. My God, Masters of the Air cost over $2 billion. I mean, I'm not going to go into that. It costs a lot of money. Okay. Yeah. And
it didn't cost $2 billion. I'll just clarify that for sure, because you probably said that by mistake, but that's not the number for sure. But go on.
Okay. So anyway, we're thinking here now. We have to decide. Our small group, we brought in John Orloff immediately. Everybody loved the two scenes in Band of Brothers that John filmed. Breakcourt Manor, which is early on, that firefight, and the film he did on the concentration camps. Why They Fight, that is called. There's hardly any dialogue in that. And we just thought, and John had some big screen experience too. And John's immersive. John throws himself into projects. He's an enthusiast. I mean, my God, for this film, Masters, he turned his office into, it looks like an Air Force office, planes, maps. John did an incredible amount of research on the 100th bomb group. I said, where'd you get this? Oh, he had a researcher. And although we weren't able to get him up in a B-17. Still haven't been able to. But John was a great researcher, and Kurt was a great researcher. And so the three of us, with at the time a guy named John Scheiban, put together what Tom wanted done first, a Bible. Now, and that's the outline of the whole series, so that they knew that they were going to have a bunch of directors, and they had to be filming simultaneously, or this thing wouldn't have come out for another 15 years.
Right.
So director 5 had to know what director 4 was doing, and 4 had to know what director 1, 2, 3 had done.
Right.
So Scheiban worked. We worked hard on the Bible. It's a Kubrick idea that Hanks was transfixed with. So we did that. It turns out we didn't use it, but we built it. God, I felt sorry for John, because, John would write a script and Kurt and I would critique it, but then, ta-da, it went to Hanks, and that was brutal. Having him
I'm sure.
Look at everything. And Tom's not a guy who yells. He's not a screamer.
Yeah.
He's instructive in his criticism. He'll help you out. When we did that Beyond All Boundaries for the museum, he narrated it. And the company we hired, a Disney company, to film it, did not do a good job. And we were scared to show it to Tom when we went out there to California. And we decided to show it to him, and he came to the studio the next day and helped us to make corrections. And I think it's a pretty good film. So, but it was intimidating. And then there were the constant interruptions. COVID and AT&T's efforts, successful to take over HBO. And they pushed aside all our favorite people that we worked with on the Pacific and band, and decided they weren't going to, after they told us they were going to do this 10-hour thing. It was a 10-hour thing originally. It's 9 now. And they're telling us, well, I don't know if these are in our future or not. Spielberg made the decision on his own, really, I think. We're gonna move. He was moving a lot of his product to Apple, and was going to do a show for Apple, and has moved a lot of it. So it only made sense for him to take everything across to Apple, and Apple just jumped on the idea, and it's been terrific. Yeah. And the nice thing is their executives are top people, and this happened to some extent at HBO. There were 2 people who were absolutely fantastic, and but you do get unusually lawyers and people in the accounting office, and not just for the money thing, but looking at it and offering advice and pitching in, and it's That's a big team. It is cool to have the full cooperation of an outfit like this.
Yeah. I mean, that clearly means that, obviously money is an important factor in life, but when there's a project that everybody believes in, there must be something right about it. Otherwise, why would anybody commit to it without financial gains and whatnot?
Exactly.
So
they kept asking, and it wasn't a pain in the neck, but they kept asking for shots, for scene shots, stills. I mean, not stills, but and they generally liked what they saw, and they had a lot of suggestions, and so they felt that they were part of the creative enterprise, and sometimes that can create jarring confrontations, because artists don't like to have businessmen, messing with the salad, and it's worked out pretty good. It's worked out pretty good. Yeah. It's been a good experience, and what I have to say too is I really admire the people, the crews who went across to England. We had several locations there. Your viewers might know this, but maybe not, that Spielberg built an entire replica of an airfield called Thorpe Abbotts, and in Abington, just right near Oxford. and very expensive enterprise, but it looks like a real base. And you should see the concentration. I thought when he was going to build a Stalag, that he was going to build one barracks. I don't know how many barracks there are, 8. And you go inside, and again, you have that fidelity thing, the shoes, the
Right.
socks, everything's exactly right. So the people who worked on that, our costume designers and things, were fantastic. Especially the guys who, as I said, who worked on the planes. I mean,
Yeah.
building them from scratch. And it's kind of
Uh,
cool to see a B-17 as it looked fresh off the factory floor, as ours were, because they flew over the 100 bomb group in new B-17s. So they did look like this inside. Yeah. Yeah.
it's you said this, and I've talked about this on this podcast with other people. Doesn't matter if it's a war film or a period piece from the 60s or 90s, whatever it is. It is so important for actors to be in that environment which feels entirely and look like the time period they're in, because it
Yeah.
it it, it throws off energy to them, and that comes out in their performance. As
That,
opposed to just building a green screen set and whatnot. It's not the same thing.
that's a great point. One of the lighting guys, I was sitting there, said he had worked at some other films, and the a TV series on Los Alamos, and he said, we were trying to do that there, but didn't have the resources to completely pull it off. But he said, we have them here, and it's a wonder to see. And everybody's so excited that there's so much attention. That means you're paying attention to them and to
Mm,
their work, and they're craftsmen, and that's fully proud of their product as an actor is. Okay. And yeah, they're rewarded for their time, but they missed their families. They wanted to go back a couple times and had to stay, because of the press of events and things. But to have that full throated cooperation was really, really encouraging, really encouraging.
right.
And to have somebody like the captain of the operation, the captain of the ship was Gary Getzman. Um, he was there the entire time in England. Once, not so much with the scripts, but once he saw all the scripts. Once we got to production, it was his show.
Mm.
It was his show. And I'm not offending Hanks or Spielberg or anybody else,
Right.
but
Yeah.
Gary was the guy with editing, with working with the actors, final product. He was on set every day. He was the commander in chief. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Um, you talked about your dad being in the Air Force, and do you remember a moment on the set? It could be any day, the beginning, the middle, and the end, where you saw all this happening, whatever sequence it was, and being in that environment of, the outfits, the sets, the design, and everything. And it made you realize at a personal level that, your dad went through this. Was there ever a moment like that? I'm sure it was, but I would love to hear about it.
Yeah. My dad was a radio gunner. Uh, they sat, just behind, in front of a bulkhead. And behind the bulkhead was the bomb. I'm looking from the back of the plane forward.
Mm,
He's sitting in a small compartment with his radio sets, gigantic radio sets, and a machine gun that stuck out the back of a window, a plexiglass window on top. So he was also a gunner. And when they prepared to ditch, except for the pilot and co-pilot, the guys would come from the front of the plane, and everybody would gather in front of the bulkhead. That was the safest place to be, because the impact was going to be so severe, and you wouldn't get thrown forward and things like that. You get thrown into the
mm,
bulkhead. Okay. And if you had to ditch, um, the life rafts went out the bomb bay door, and you could go out the bomb bay door. if you wanted a parachute out. But it was the safest place. And when they all gathered there like that, I thought, geez,
Hmm.
I wonder how that felt, you know, to be going down into the North Sea. And we didn't have at the time, the Air Force didn't have rescue crews. The British did all the work in the beginning. By 44, the Americans did. But air sea rescue was a British operation. And you depended upon the Brits keeping radio contact with your plane as it came over across the Netherlands and toward the cliffs of Dover and then into the sea. And unlike the scene in Dunkirk, the plane sinks fast. There's not a lot of chance, you know, to save yourself unless you got on one of those life rafts and things.
Right.
But by the end of the war, they're saving a lot of these guys. I thought of that, and I thought of the caprice. My dad's final job with the Air Force was as an air controller. Air Force, didn't call them that. They were control tower operators. That's what they were called when I was a kid. And my dad was a control tower operator in the service. And the role that weather played in this thing and the ups and downs. I mean, you have enough trauma to deal with thinking about missions.
Yeah.
But then to get called into the plane, fully dressed, go through the whole thing, the briefing, the blessing by the Catholic priest, the prayer by the Protestant priest. There were no rabbis. And then to get on the tarmac, start up the engine. The guys are ready to pull the blocks off the wheels and you're going to roll. And you sit there for 3 and 4 hours and you're not going to fly. It's scrubbed because of storms. The weather's beautiful, but it's really bad over Hamburg. So you can't go. And then what they had to think about was the weather had to be right over England, on the way, over the target, coming back, and over your base when you got back. And that was impossible. So you were always going to run into lots of bad weather. And lots of planes crashed in England or crashed on the continent, not because of enemy fire, but because of the engines froze up or, mechanical difficulties caused by the weather or fog or something like that. And when they took off about every 12 seconds apart. We don't do that anymore at airports. And they spiraled up and into a cloud bank of clouds and fog that perpetually hung over these bases. And sometimes it would take you over an hour, sometimes 2 hours, till you popped out of this fog bank like a trout in the stream popping out of the water, and everything was clean and clear and beautiful and sunny. But then again, weather, you think, shit, if the sun's out, they can see us. Better clouds. Yeah. It's a good hunting day for the Wehrmacht. Yeah. With clear skies. Yeah.
Well,
so.
Yeah, no, Donald, we've got just a little bit of time left. So I wanted to ask you one last question. Anything that you can talk about, I don't even know what would that be. Any story, any experience you had on the set without giving anything away? Because I don't want to know anything myself. You can share.
Well, there is one scene. It's a little bit of a giveaway. And we were trying to get across the despair that a lot of the guys started to feel. A despair that approached mutiny on a couple of occasions. Because after all, you're not just taking staggering losses, but you don't seem to be bombing effectively. You're missing the target a lot. They have these target maps and they're showing you that we're not doing the kind of damage we thought we could. Right. The futility of that and how depressing it was looking ahead. and your chances of surviving. So I actually picked this out to see as an example of this kind of feeling. And this is a story of a shot up B-17, and it's limping home to England, all banged up, and it calls the control tower. Now, it's not exactly true, but things like this happened all over the place, and the story was repeated all over England. And a lot of guys believed it because it's a story that, although part not true, expressed something very important. And it goes, he calls the tower. Hello, Lazy Fox. This is G for George calling Lazy Fox. Will you give me landing instructions, please? Pilot and co-pilot dead, 2 engines feathered, fire in the radio room, vertical stabilizer going, no flaps, no brakes. Crew bailed out, bombardier flying the ship. Give me landing instructions. The reply comes seconds later. I hear you, G for George. Here are your instructions. Repeat slowly, please repeat slowly. Our Father, who art in heaven. And that's a scene that we do in the guys talk about that, and they wonder if it's true or not, but they think it sure could be true, because things like that happen a lot with the other crewmen, a bombardier or somebody taking the plane in.
No, I bet it's been a privilege and wonderful experience talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for writing the book, which is now turning into a series. I would love, if you're up for it, to talk about the series as we get closer, or during the series, or after. Just maybe even episode by episode. That would be, if that, again, you have time. I would love to do that. I'm really looking forward to it. Really excited.
I really enjoyed the interview. I enjoyed your emotive interest in the thing, your emotional interest in the thing. That really came through, and it was important to me.
Thank you so much
again.
Thank you so much.
Time. Have a good day.
You too. Take care now. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment, and do come back for another episode. Until then, have a great day.